My youth mission was, I was called to South Australia. Now there's several missions there, but in the mission when I arrived, they had only recently divided the mission. It used to be just one mission for the whole of the continent of Australia. And Australia is only 150 square miles smaller than the continental United States. It's just an incredibly sized continent. But at any rate, they had divided the mission. We had four of the different locations. We had South Australia, we had Victoria, Western Australia, and Tasmania in our mission. I served, I started out in a little community called Box Hill, or not Box Hill, that was, can't remember anyway, forget that. But anyway, we Woodville Gardens was the name of that place. I worked there for about 4 months. And then I was one of those fortunate missionaries, very, very fortunate missionaries, that were called to serve in the country districts. So I went to the bush. I served there for well over a year. We served in Whyalla, which was a little seaport town that was 30 miles from Iron Knob. Iron Knob was a whole mountain of nothing but iron ore. And so they created a shipbuilding industry there at Whyalla. And I was there to watch 2 ships launched that they had built. And I was called to serve in Ballarat. Ballarat is in Victoria, but it was one of the larger branches of the church. I was called as the presiding elder to go there and manage the affairs of that branch. I was there for about 6 months, and then they called me to, it was still in the country, it was out in the bush. Then I was called to serve in Box Hill. Box Hill is closer to Melbourne. It was a thriving community. But once again, it was the largest branch of the church. And I was called as the branch president of that branch. I had local counselors. I had all of the local positions filled. But they wanted to keep a missionary in as branch president because he could give full time to it instead of having to work and then find the time or make the time to do what needed to be done. So I served at Box Hill as the branch president. Had some wonderful, unbelievable experiences. I was called one night in the middle of the night and told that one of our members' home had burned down. And I had a car. So we got in the car early that morning and drove up to where she lived, about 40 miles from where the branch was located. And all that was remaining in her home was the veranda, just a porch. Everything else was gone. Her husband was a drinker, not a member of the church, but he had taken off, left them. And before we left there, she asked me if I would accept her tithing. She'd saved it for years. Unable to attend church, husband wouldn't let that happen. She gave me a jar, scorched, but full of money. That was her tithing. I even made the mistake of trying to tell her maybe she should keep that and see if there were needs that would have to be met, that maybe that could help satisfy. And she accused me of denying her the blessings that would come through receiving that. So I took her tithing. Later on, a week or so later, we got another call from her mother indicating that she had been to the hospital, and on examination they discovered a tumor in her brain that had never been successfully operated on. But she was facing that dilemma. What was she to do? I can't remember whether she had 2 or 3 little kids, but it was a real problem for her. We drove up to her house. I took a companion that I went to Australia with. We drove up to her home and her little veranda. And she asked for a blessing. And her statement was that she knew if she could go into the hospital for that surgery with the blessing under the hands of the priesthood, that she would survive. So we gave her a blessing. We anointed and sealed that blessing with a lot of feeling. There was tenderness, but there was also the Spirit of the Lord that guided that final sealing. She went into the hospital the next day for the surgery. They re-examined to ascertain what exactly would be the best approach to use, and they couldn't find a tumor. There was absolutely no tumor. She was released later that afternoon to go home. We had so many of those kinds of experiences while I was serving there, over and again. Had a young lady who was French. She just come from France and couldn't speak English. And she found herself being cared for by a hooligan who only kept her because of what he could get from her. And she ended up being pregnant and was going to have to give the baby away. He would not allow the baby in their home, and if she was going to stay, she had to give the baby away. So we were called, and I talked to the mission president. He said, "You'll do the right thing." He didn't have any counsel. But we went. She was in a Catholic hospital. We had to force our way in, but with the use of our certifications, they wouldn't let us in otherwise. But when we were able, through a translator, to communicate with her, she asked us if we would be willing to take care of that adoption, if we'd find the family for her, which we did. I had 2 families in the branch, Box Hill branch, who'd never been able to have children. Wanted them with all their heart, but hadn't been able to be successful. So the younger of those 2 families, we decided would probably be the best reception for the baby. And I'll tell you, Sean, the most difficult thing I think I had ever done in my life was to this little French girl wanted to meet the parents. We weren't sure that was the best thing to do, but she insisted on it. So we took the parents to the hospital, and to take that baby from that young mother who wanted with all her heart to keep the baby, to take that baby and put it in the arms of a receiving mother that had prayed for that kind of experience for years. Brought both joy and a lot of tears, a lot of pain. I don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like that. But the family received the baby and was very, very happy about that. And there was no more problems. The president was right. We did the right thing, and it worked out to at least this family's advantage. But we just had, and while I was there, I have to say, I was sent there with a special commission from the mission president. It was the largest branch in our mission, and he said, "We want to build a chapel." And they've not even paid for the ground that we were on. So he says, the first thing you need to do is get the ground paid for, pay your property, and then we want to raise enough money that they can qualify for a church building. They had church building missionaries assigned to our country, and they would be there for another 6 months or so. And they said, if we can't do that, if we can't raise the money, pay for the ground, and have enough money to build a church, it'll be another 5 years before we get that building missionaries back in this country. So that was my commission. And I went in there, and I'll tell you, Sean, those people they gave where there was nothing to give. They were absolutely unbelievable. And we paid off the ground and raised enough money that we qualified for a new building on that property. And it was wonderful. I was invited to the groundbreaking ceremony, which occurred just shortly before I was released to come home. Following my experience in Box Hill, I was called to serve as a counselor in the mission presidency. They didn't have assistants to the presidents in those days. They had one missionary that was identified as a counselor in the presidency. And I had weekly meetings with the mission president all the time I was at Box Hill. We'd sit down and go over everything that was happening in the branch, and where we stood financially, what was occurring, what was in the future, and what my plans were. And he was very gracious to me. But on my last visit with him on that business of the branch, he asked me to stay for just a minute after the meeting was over. So I want to read a letter to you. And so he pulled out this letter from the First Presidency in the Quorum of the 12, authorizing him to call me to serve as his counselor. And so for the last several months of my mission, I served in the mission presidency. Lots of experiences there that I won't burden you with. But it was in most ways, it was a wonderful experience. I will tell you one thing. The mission president had to be in all we didn't have stakes, we had districts, and so he had to attend all these district conferences, and he would take me one time and he'd take his first counselor the second time. But I was always responsible to structure all the transportation for how many people were going to be there and all the rest of it. That was part of my duty, was to make sure that all of those business essentials were tended to. And so he had a conference in Western Australia, in Perth, and it's clear across the nation. And for some reason, I don't know why, I can't remember if there was even a justification for it, but I had not made those arrangements. And they have in Western Australia every year, it's a tradition, they have a big horse show. And if you don't have your reservations 6 months in advance, you're not getting reservations. That's all there is to it. Seems like everybody with any kind of money at all would go to this big show, horse show, over at Perth. And it came exactly the same time as that conference. Now, it wasn't that I had forgotten about it and wasn't going to do it or whatnot, but usually you could get reservations within 3 to 4 months, no problem at all. So I had let some time slack, and when I called the travel agent that I always dealt with, he just hooted over the phone. He said, listen, you may as well be asking for the moon. There is no way in this world that we're going to be able to make reservations for 9 people to go to Perth on that week. It just doesn't happen. And so I didn't know what to do. I was deeply frustrated. I prayed a lot about it. I tried to tell the Lord I hadn't neglected a duty. It was just something that was an oversight. Could there be something done? And would He manifest His power through making available those resources? I'd just come away from one of my prayers, and the phone rang on my desk. It was my travel agent. And he said, President Raisor, have you been praying? And I said, I have. And he said, well, we've just witnessed the miracle of the year. He said, I just had cancellations of 9 people who were going to that horse show. And he says, that's never, ever happened before. But if you want those reservations, you can have them. So, I over and again, Sean, in my youth mission as well as others, I've seen the hand of the Lord in preparing the way for His work to continue. And it was just a marvelous experience for me to be able to experience that and enjoy the camaraderie of the mission presidency and all that they stood for. Yeah, it was a wonderful mission. But I'll tell you the one thing, Sean, that made it more special than anything else. I believe that mission was the best thing that could have happened between Myrna and me, because it grounded me in relationships. I was responsible in mission presidency for all of the missionary companionships. If anybody had a problem, they had to work through me before it ever got to the mission president. And I saw a few issues where, it was just selfishness, along with a few hurt feelings and whatnot. But I think that experience grounded me in what has become a relationship that people sometimes refuse to believe. We've just had such a marvelous relationship over the years. We love each other. And we determined, you have to understand, we grew up during President McKay's leadership of the church, and he and Emma Ray was the ideal of the church, the whole church, worldwide, because of the way they treated each other. They loved each other so much. And we decided very early on in our relationship that was what was going to happen with us. And we've literally seen the fulfillment of that. We've had people come into our home and tell us there's a spirit here that they couldn't feel anywhere else other than the temple. And they just really love being here. And we're glad they feel that way.
Myrna, what was it like for you while Max was away?
Well, I was in high school. I was in many business classes. I had typing and shorthand and accounting, and this prepared me to get a job after I graduated. But I was totally devoted to him. I didn't want to have that go bad, and we just loved each other so much before that we wanted that to be forever. So I didn't date. I was really busy in church positions, and that helped the time to go by faster. But the most important man in my life at that time was the mailman. And but the last year of his mission, he only wrote
11 letters.
11 letters, so, but each one was a choice letter. So, but it was meant to be, and we have been grateful all of our lives that is how it worked out. And we're just grateful for all the children that have blessed our lives, come into our lives, and we want them to know that the most important thing in our lives is to so live as the Savior would have us live, and be guided by our latter-day prophets and the prophets all down through the ages in the scriptures, that we want to always be an eternal family together and not to have one child lost. So that means we're all going to have to do a whole bunch of work to make that come about. But we're so grateful for each one of our children and their lives in our lives, and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. We counted up the other day, and we figure we're to about 85 members of our family as soon as your little son is born, Sean, and as soon as Charity's son is born in June. But the gospel has been the biggest part of our lives. Always. Always we have wanted to live the commandments fully and be able to have the Spirit in our home and with our children. So that's most important to us.